This is a lecture from OpenTuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.
All right, this is a lecture on chapter 13, and we're still on process costing, because I did mention in one of the earlier lectures there are three distinct problem areas that you can be examined on. So in the last lecture we went through losses. This lecture is something completely different, which is work in progress. And in the introductory lecture to process costing, I did mention it. It's a situation where maybe we're working on 1,000 units, but some of those units have been completed and had all the work done on them. Other units perhaps are only part finished. And of course, if they've only had half the work done on them, it would be wrong to value them at the same amount as units that are completely finished. To show you what the problem is and how we deal with it, can you look at example 1? During January, the following costs were incurred in a process. Materials, 5,000, labour 2,760, overhead 3,440. We were working on 1,000 units, but during the month, 800 units were finished and they were transferred to another process. The other 200 units were work in progress. We were still working on them, they're part finished. And they were complete as follows. The materials, it was 100% there. Maybe we're making desks and all the wood is there. But we've not finished the labour. We've only done 60% of the work. The rest will be done next month. And similarly, the overheads. They've only had 30% of the overheads on them. The rest will be next month. And the main job is to calculate the cost per unit. So we're going to do costings very much in the normal way. But we'll need to do a bit more work. And first of all, because of the different levels of completion, materials 100% finished, labour only 60% finished. The only way we can do it, as you'll see, is to value each bit separately. What's the materials cost per unit? What's the labour cost per unit? What's the overhead cost per unit? And when we've got that, we can add the three together and get the total cost of a unit. How you set it out is up to you. I think the easiest is to do it in columns. But we're going to look at each cost separately. Materials, labour, overheads. And we say, first of all, how much did we spend in total on each of them? Well, that's easy. Materials, we spent 5,000. Labour, 2,760. Overheads, 3,440. We then say, what did we spend it on? Well, that money has been spent on two things. It's been spent on some units which were completely finished, so some of the money was spent finishing some units completely, but some of the money was also spent starting the work in progress. And let's look at these units. First of all, how many units were finished completely? 800. And they'd had the full work. We've done a full 800 units work on materials, on labour, on overheads, because they've been finished. In addition, though, there were 200 units work in progress. Well, let's think about each separately. First of all, materials. They'd had 100% of the work done on them. And so materials, we'd spent the money on a full 200 units. And so materials, I can finish. The money we'd spent, as far as materials are concerned, we finished 1,000 units. And so the cost per unit $5,000 over 1,000, $5. What about labour though? We'd spent 2,760, and okay, those 800 that were finished have had the full cost, a full 800 units worth of work. But the work in progress, although we'd done work on 200 units, we'd only done 60% of the work. And so we say, okay, doing 60% work on 200 units, it's going to be exactly the same from a cost point of view as doing the full work, on 60% of 200, which is 120 units. So 60% work on 200 is going to cost exactly the same as if we'd done the full work on 120 units. And so it's effectively as though we spent 2,760 making 920 full units. And we say, all right, the cost of a full unit for labour is therefore 2,760 divided by 920, $3. Now think about that, because it's that logic that goes all the way through these examples. This idea that doing 60% work on 200 units will be exactly the same cost as doing the full work on 120. What about overheads? That money was spent doing full work on the finished ones, the 800. But as far as the work in progress is concerned, since they were only 30% finished, we've only done 30% of the work. 30% work on 200, we say, is effectively the same as if we'd done the full work on 60. And therefore the cost per unit with regard to overheads, 3,440, effectively doing 860 units, comes to how much a unit? $4. So a finished unit, we say, costs $5 for materials, $3 for labour, $4 for overheads. And therefore the total cost of a finished unit add them together, $5, $8, $12. Now, before I do a bit more, just one bit of terminology. This idea of saying 60% work on 200 units is equivalent to 120, 30% on 200 is equivalent to 60. We call these equivalent units. Obviously, we didn't make 60, it was 200, but 30% work is equivalent to 60. All right, well, now let's do our costings proper. We know the cost per unit, but now let's value what happens. The valuations. Well, first of all, the finished units, that's easy. The finished units, the output, there are 800. They'll be valued at the full cost of $12, 9,600. What about the work in progress, though? The WIP. There were 200 units, but how are they going to be valued? Well, we're going to have to do it bit by bit. As far as the materials are concerned, well, they've had the full work, 100% work done for materials, and so they'll be valued at the full material cost of $5. But what about labour? There were 200 units in work in progress, but they've only had 60% of the work done, and so we'll only value them at 60% of the labour cost, and the labour cost was $3 for a full unit. So if a full unit is $3, well, if it's 60% work, they'll value at 60% of 3. So what does that come to? 200 times 60% of 3 is 360. And finally, what about the overheads? Again, there were 200 units, but since they've only had 30% of the work, we'll only value them at 30% of the unit cost, which for overheads was $4. And so 200, 30% of 4 is 240. And so what's the total value of the work in progress? 1,000 plus 360 plus 240. The work in progress will be valued at 1,600. Now, as far as the exam's concerned, with example 1, that's as much as is likely to be asked. They test you that you know what equivalent units are. They can test you on getting the cost of a finished unit, $12. You can be tested on valuing the total output, 9.6, or the total work in progress. Just as in the previous chapter, the process account is extremely unlikely. Just to be safe, though, and to show how it's all working, let me do it. Process account. As always, debit with the costs. So materials, units, dollars. 1,000 units, 5,000. Labour, 2,760. Overheads, 3,440. What happened to these items? Well, first of all, 800 of them were finished and they were transferred out or output. And we've just valued them. They've got a value of 9,600. The other 200 were work in progress, carried forward, and the work in progress 200, and we valued them at 1,600. Does it balance? It should do. 1,000 units are accounted for. As far as the costs on the debit side, the total we spent $11,200. Here, yeah, 11,200. So there we are, except, rather importantly for what's coming, at the end of that month, there are 200 units in work in progress, on inventory effectively, on which we spent 1,600. Next month, we would start with 200 units. We'd already spent 1,600, and of course, next month, part of the money spent would be to finish those 200. So there we are. That's work in progress. The only thing is, though, this one, there was no work in progress at the start of this month. There will be at the start of next month, but there was none at the start of this month. And if there is work in progress at the start of the month, then it just gives us a little bit extra complication, particularly because there are 2 different ways you could be asked to deal with it. Now, I'll deal with that in the next lecture. I'm going to split this lecture into 2 or 3, this chapter rather. But before you watch the next lecture, obviously make sure you are happy about this idea of equivalent units and the way I went around just now doing the costings.